Right. Thank you to everybody for joining us here in person and on Zoom. This is our first Monday Lunch and Learn of the semester. Our next one will be on October 21st with Dr. Ralph Craig. That one will be at 12:15 Pacific time, maybe a little closer to lunchtime. And his talk is entitled The Secret Combination, Tina Turner and Black Buddhism. But for now, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Annabella Pitkin, my friend and colleague who I met many years ago at Columbia University, where she earned a PhD in religion. I also know her from the yoga practice world, so we've been in multiple worlds together. Dr. Pitkin is a scholar of Buddhist literature, culture, and intellectual history, with a focus on Tibet and the Himalayan region, where she has lived and traveled extensively. Dr. Pitkin is the Associate Professor of Buddhism and East Asian Religions at Lehigh University. Her wonderful book, Renunciation and Longing, The Life of a 20th-Century Himalayan Buddhist Saint, published by University of Chicago Press in 2022, explores themes of non-attachment, devotion, and memory in the life and work of the great poet-meditator Khunu Lama Tenzin Gyaltsen, who she will be telling us about today. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. I have her book here if anybody wants to take a look at it afterwards. It's beautiful. Her talk is entitled White Lotuses and Spring Rains, Nature, Imagery, and Buddhist Practice in the Poems of Khunu Lama Tenzin Gyaltsen, and I will leave her to tell us all about it. Thank you for being here with us today.
Wonderful. It's great to virtually be with you guys. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I'm sort of dreaming that I'm on the West Coast, seeing the lovely sunlight coming through the windows where the in-person folks are. I am on the East Coast in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where the sun is already setting and it's kind of gray and rainy. So I will sort of virtually be with you, and I will live vicariously through your California lunchtime that you're having. And it's wonderful to see you all. I want to begin by expressing my thanks to Dr. Zoe Sladoff and also to Dr. Chappell for inviting me, and to the Yoga Studies program and to Loyola Marymount for having me in this virtual way. It's great to get to talk with you all about something that is very dear to my heart, which is the poetry of the great 20th century Tibetan Buddhist meditator and scholar, Khunu Lama Tenzin Gyaltsen. And as Zoe mentioned, that is the focus of my first book. So I think what would probably be good is, if you don't mind losing my giant head, is I will share my screen and show you much more lovely images than my own giant head, and walk us through some little exploration, just a little kind of lunchtime reflection on the role of nature imagery and the relationship between nature imagery and Buddhist practice in these wonderful poems. And I'll begin by setting up a little bit who we're talking about. Now let's see, can everybody see the image of Khunu Lama? On my screen, I see, pictures of you guys, and they block part of my screen, but I trust that where you are, yes, it looks like the big screen is clear. Wonderful. So here's a picture from the end of Khunu Lama's life. I didn't take this picture. A wonderful colleague, Anasuya Wild, shared it with me. And Khunu Lama Tenzin Gyaltsen, as you can see from this picture, perhaps, was a somewhat unusual, maybe even anomalous figure. As his dates tell, he was a 20th century person. You can see that I have his name written in Tibetan above his name in English. And so that's a little bit of a clue that he was a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner and teacher, and that is true. It's also a clue that he himself studied and worked and wrote in the Tibetan language, and that's also true. And at the same time, you might also notice that in the picture, he's not exactly wearing conventional Tibetan Buddhist monks' robes. And if you're noticing that, that would also be a very astute observation. Khunu Lama was a person from a border area. He was a person from a hybrid, we could say, region, a place in the Indian Himalaya that looks like this. The region is called Kinor. In Tibetan, Kinor is Khunu, hence Khunu Lama's name. He's the Lama from the Kinor region. Kinor is a high altitude valley in the Himalayas in present day Indian Himachal Pradesh. But the portion of Khunu that Khunu Lama was from, Upper Khunu, is very, very close to the Tibetan border. In fact, it basically looks like Tibet, you might say. He was born in a small village, not so small now, but small when he was born there, Sunam. And the region of Upper Kinor that he was from is very closely connected historically with Tibet. People traded back and forth, people traveled back and forth. And importantly, for our purposes, many people in Upper Kinor did all of their scholarship and much of their religious lives in the Tibetan language. And they also often went into Tibet for the purposes of study, for the purposes of religious study in particular. So Khunu Lama Tenzin Gyaltsen very much fit this model. He was born in a Buddhist family. He was the middle of three brothers. His grandfather had spent a lot of time in Tibet and was quite locally famous because of that. His brothers were traders who often went back and forth to Tibet. And unsurprisingly, then, he began to study Tibetan language as a little boy when he was 7. And then he continued on as a student in a monastic college in his home valley. But when he was 19, in 1914, he ran away from home. He decided he wanted to devote his life to Buddhist practice. And his parents, who sound like they must have loved him very much, they didn't want him to go so far away. They wanted him to stay close by with the rest of the family and practice Buddhism and study Buddhism there. But Khunu Lama was deeply committed. He's very famous for this now. He was deeply committed to a model of Buddhist practice that centers on very profound kind of renunciation. So for those of you who may not have a sense of what renunciation can mean in a religious studies context, we could say that renunciation is a kind of voluntary, maybe even potentially joyful giving up of the ordinary attachments that someone has to things like wealth or other people's approval, or even to feeling like the people that you care about are being nice to you at a particular moment. And in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, that kind of non-attachment is seen as the sort of groundstone, the foundation of all other kinds of spiritual activity. Because, as many of you probably know very, very well from the courses that you're taking at Loyola, the Buddhist diagnosis of why people are often unhappy is that people are kind of tightly gripped onto an attachment to their own preferences, to what they think will make them happy. But the Buddhist claim is that although it's wonderful to want to be happy, and we should want to be happy, and in fact, healthy organisms are oriented toward being happy, human beings, and actually all living things, are not very good at predicting what will make them happy. And they try to hang on to things that by their nature are changing all the time. And this produces a lot of sorrow and loss. And it can also produce a lot of harm and violence and cruelty when people try to grab things from others or hold on to things forever in an unchanging way. And the Buddhist claim is that this whole kind of grasping, addictive relationship to ourselves and our experiences and our possessions and our relationships, even our family lives, is rooted in a kind of ignorance, a kind of miscognition or misrecognition of what we and the rest of reality are really like. And if we were to perceive reality as it is, we would notice that reality is relational. Everything is related, everything interconnects, Buddhists call this interdependence. And because of this, there are very profound Buddhist claims that are made about the possibility of caring for everyone in the way that one cares for one's own beloved family. And the claim is that by cultivating this kind of care on the foundation of a renunciation or a non-attachment to one's own temporary preferences, one can generate enormous benefit for oneself and others, maybe even ultimate benefit for oneself and others. And so that frame of the Buddhist understanding of the spiritual path underlies Khunu Lama's decision to leave home, even though his parents didn't want him to, in order to pursue both intellectual scholarly training in Buddhist subjects and literatures, and also the most advanced kinds of meditation trainings that were available. And he did this by traveling all over the Tibetan plateau. He traveled mostly on foot and sometimes on horseback, and occasionally by train, but really quite shockingly, a lot on foot. He traveled literally thousands of kilometers over the course of something like 20 to 25 years. So if you can see the map, and I don't know how this looks on the big screen, Khunu Lama was born here in Kannur, in this little village called Sunam. And then he traveled secretly, probably partly by train, through probably Benares and Bodh Gaya, because that's where the British train lines went, but then up into Sikkim to Gangtok, and then onwards past Bhutan and into central Tibet. And then he spent a lot of time in Tibet, and he went all the way east in Tibet, all the way to the cultural border with China. He spent more than 2 decades there, and he received transmissions from 22 different remarkable lamas, Buddhist teachers, all of whom he recognized later as his root gurus. And he also connected with many, many other men and women who were very serious Buddhist practitioners. He became a kind of human library, repository of Buddhist transmissions and teachings. And notably, he studied with women teachers, and he would go on to have many female students as well as male students. He made something of a point of teaching quite extensively to women as well as to men. And in addition to his Buddhist meditation studies and all of the rituals and initiations and things that he received, he also, can you guys hear me okay? Okay. He also received many opportunities to study literature. And he became one of the great literary scholars in Tibetan of the 20th century. But not only that, he also became one of the great Tibetan intellectual world scholars of Sanskrit. And this should not surprise us that much because, as you've just seen, he grew up on the border between India and Tibet. He was very much an Indo-Tibetan scholar. So Tibetans remember him as a great saint, as an extraordinary meditator, as an extraordinary Buddhist teacher, and also as an incredible scholar, an amazing Sanskritist in particular. After the Chinese invasion and occupation of Tibet that began in 1950 and that reached a crisis point with a crackdown in 1959, Tibetan traditional culture on the plateau suffered an enormous violent disruption. And for decades, between 1950 up until the early 1980s, Tibetan Buddhist learning and also the larger streams of Tibetan intellectual life were severely disrupted for several decades. Both religious practice and traditional forms of intellectual study were banned. You've probably heard of the Cultural Revolution. It was particularly violent and acute in the Tibetan regions. And what this means is that Khunu Lama, who had left Tibet in the end of the 1930s and spent the rest of his life living and traveling all over India, Khunu Lama was there when the 14th Dalai Lama and some 100,000 Tibetan refugees fled over the border from Tibet into India. And Khunu Lama was able to serve as a kind of a bridge to the Tibetan, often Sanskrit inflected Tibetan, that linked Tibetans with their remarkable, extraordinary millennia of intellectual and religious and poetic past. And he served as a teacher to multiple generations of young Tibetan practitioners of Buddhism and also scholars. There's a picture here of him teaching someone who's quite famous now, whose name is Chukyinima Rinpoche, who's based in Kathmandu and who teaches all over the world. Chukyinima Rinpoche is very young in this picture. Rinpoche wasn't sure exactly how old he was in this picture, but he's probably in his late teens. And Khunu Lama, perhaps most famously, became one of the Buddhist teachers of His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama. In particular, Khunu Lama taught His Holiness a range of important Mahayana Buddhist texts, and notably, a work of Khunu Lama's own composition, the work that I'm here to talk with you about. So I wrote this lovely book that Dr. Sladoff mentioned about Khunu Lama's life, and I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about his life anymore today, because I want to focus on him as a poet and a Sanskrit scholar from this Himalayan bicultural cultural border location of Kinnour, where he had deep roots and connections in Tibetan culture and literatures and forms of Buddhist practice, and equally deep roots in the Indian subcontinent and in an Indian linguistic, especially Sanskrit world. The book that Khunu Lama taught to the 14th Dalai Lama is the work of scholarship and creative art that is widely recognized as Khunu Lama's masterpiece. It is called The Jewel Lamp, Verses in Praise of Bodhicitta. And it is the product of a remarkable self-cultivation exercise. In the year 1959, you might remember that I just said that was the year that there was a Chinese communist crackdown in Tibet, and the 14th Dalai Lama and about 100,000 other Tibetans fled as refugees over the border into India, forming the beginning of the Tibetan diaspora, or refugee community. So it's an interesting year that Khunu Lama picked, and he set himself the task of writing a poem a day for the year, for various reasons having to do with the Tibetan calendar and also other events and interruptions. He wrote 356 poems, not 365. That's not a typo, that's the number of poems. And each of the poems is 4 lines long, and they are gathered together into this remarkable book called The Jewel Lamp, Verses in Praise of Bodhicitta. So we'll think a little bit in a moment about what this term bodhicitta means, and we can also unpack this metaphor of a lamp made out of jewels through which multicolored light comes pouring out. But before we go there, I just want to mention what you're seeing on the screen. Khunu Lama's work was composed in 1959. It was first published with an intro by His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama in 1966, and it remains very much in print in multiple languages. So you see the orange volume in Tibetan is a 2003 printing of the verses by Khunu Lama with an extensive commentary by a present-day Tibetan scholar, Atsok Tenzin Gyaltsen. On the left in purple with a photo of Khunu Lama teaching, you see the 1999 English language translation of the poems by the wonderful English translator Gareth Sparham. And there was also a 2004 German translation. There are Tibetan traditional format woodblock prints. Here's an image of Khunu Lama from the woodblock print. You can see his trademark glasses. And one of the things that's so remarkable about this book, and one reason it's remained in print and is so popular, is that the 14th Dalai Lama often teaches it. So this is actually quite striking. Traditionally, figures like the Dalai Lama don't teach contemporary works very often, maybe even almost never. It is extremely rare that something by a 20th century author or a present day author would be something that a figure like the Dalai Lama would give mass public Buddhist lectures on. But he has done so several times. I especially like this image of him reading from it. And the Dalai Lama received the transmission of this work directly from Khunu Lama himself. That was one of the main teachings that he received from Khunu Lama. Okay, so that's enough kind of backstory. Let's turn to what this work is and to the role of nature imagery in this work. And I'll try to keep my remarks relatively brief. I'll walk you through a few examples of the poems and highlight a few themes and explain what this core term bodhicitta means. And then I'll leave some time at the end so that we can hopefully have a Q&A, even though I'm up here on the giant screen as a disembodied head. But I hope very much that you all will not be shy and will talk to me and ask me questions. So here is a verse. It's a verse that comes quite late in the collection in the order that they're in now. It's verse 216, but it really kind of sums up what this core term bodhicitta is for Khunu Lama. So many of you probably know this term bodhicitta, but if not, let's take a moment to think a little bit about what it means. So the Sanskrit scholars among you will probably notice that it has two parts, bodhi and chitta. So chitta should be familiar as a word that might mean something like mind. And bodhi, of course, is our wonderful word that is related to the word Buddha, that means something like enlightenment. You've probably heard of the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, right? All of those are that same word from that same root Bud. And we can translate this term bodhicitta in the way that Mahayana Buddhists do as the mental state, the mind that aspires toward bodhi, that aspires toward enlightenment. And actually, Mahayana Buddhists want to say more about it than that. They want to give an even more elaborate gloss. Mahayana Buddhists want to say that bodhicitta is a special kind of mental attitude in which an individual cultivates the aspiration to become a fully enlightened Buddha, specifically in order to benefit all other beings. So bodhicitta, as Mahayana Buddhists define it, is a fundamentally altruistic, selfless attitude, an attitude in which other people's happiness is as important as one's own, in fact, even more important than one's own happiness. Of course, the irony is that by cultivating the happiness of others in this special way, one produces one's own supreme happiness as well. Because in the Mahayana analysis, the ultimate happiness that is possible for any kind of being is full enlightenment and Buddhahood. And the way to achieve that is by generating bodhicitta, which produces one's own Buddhahood, but which by definition is the altruistic intention to bring all other living beings to Buddhahood. So in this little 4-line verse, Khunu Lama sums up this attitude. And I'll stick with English going forward, but I'll just read a little bit of Tibetan just so we have some Tibetan in our minds. Khunu Lama says, Changchuk semgi rangdun drup, Changchuk semgi shendun drup, Changchuk semgi jikpapong, Changchuk semgi nyemboche. So he says, through bodhicitta, your aim's fulfilled. Through bodhicitta, others' aims as well. Through bodhicitta, cast out fear. Through bodhicitta, provide the cure. So through bodhicitta, your aim is fulfilled. You become a Buddha, free from suffering, infinitely omniscient, filled with bliss, benefiting beings. Through bodhicitta, you also fulfill the aims of all other living beings by freeing them from suffering and helping them become Buddhas. And importantly, Khunu Lama says, bodhicitta is the antidote to fear. It's the cure for fear. And in some of my other work on these poems, I have speculated that what we might hear in this verse and in some of the other verses in the Jewel Lamp, ones that I won't spend very much time on today, but that are very well worth reading and thinking about, perhaps we do hear some echo of the terrible trauma that Tibet was undergoing in 1959, which Khunu Lama, we know from his diary entries, was learning about and following along with every day on the radio and in the newspapers in India. So he was terribly worried about his friends and his gurus, and most of all about the 14th Dalai Lama. And he was watching the people who had cared for him and educated him and welcomed him since he was a 19-year-old undergoing a kind of cataclysm. And we sometimes hear him say in the verses that bodhicitta is the antidote to fear, to anger, to despair, to violence, and to all of the terrors that go with that. So perhaps here there's a little hint of this sense that in unbearable circumstances, bodhicitta provides some kind of an avenue. Let's keep going. So if we think a little bit about the themes of the Jewel Lamp, we could say that it's a twofer. On the one hand, as I've just outlined, the main theme of the Jewel Lamp, of course, is how to generate bodhicitta, this compassionate aspiration to become a fully enlightened Buddha for the sake of all living beings. But one of my arguments is that it turns out not to be an accident or some sort of, quirk that Khunu Lama chooses to express this in poetic form, and in a very particular kind of poetic form, in a cultivated literary style of elegant Tibetan poetry. Khunu Lama actually makes the argument across many of the poems that there is a parallel, a resonance, a mutual support between the practices of literary cultivation in Tibetan and actually also in Sanskrit, and the practices of Buddhist self-cultivation. In fact, they go together. So poetic cultivation, in classic Sanskrit and Tibetan poetry and poetics, we could call this the kavya tradition in Sanskrit or the nyingak tradition in Tibetan, actually supports the practices of mental cultivation, mind training, or lojong. The kind of lojong that you've probably heard of is called tonglen, sending and receiving, which is a practice that's quite widely taught in the yoga world as well as in the Tibetan Buddhist world. And all of the mind training practices are practices for directly cultivating this Mahayana attitude of bodhicitta, where one has love and compassion for living beings and generates the wish to become a Buddha for their sake on that basis. The most famous way to think about this mind training is either that one exchanges other people's sadness for one's own happiness, one kind of sends them happiness mentally, or one imagines all living beings as one's beloved parents, and one generates the wish to care for them just as one cares for the parents of this particular lifetime. And for parents, we might substitute whatever adults cared for us when we were at our most vulnerable. So bodhicitta is a kind of practice of gratitude and love and care, as well as some kind of meditation, maybe focused on concentration or calmness, right? It adds one more layer. So this is a cultivated practice. One of the things that the Mahayana tradition says, the Tibetan Buddhist tradition says, and that Khunu Lama says over and over and over again in the poems, is you have to work at this. You actually have to do practices to cultivate this altruistic attitude in your mind. And this is a lot like writing poetry. You have to kind of work at it. You have to learn how to do it and to make it beautiful. And for the poet, writing about poetry and also writing about cultivating the mind of bodhicitta, nature turns out to offer wonderful examples, similes, and metaphors for this process. we could think of that in its technical term as alamkara, poetic ornamentation in Sanskrit. And so the Tibetan poetic tradition embraces and kind of absorbs and digests the Sanskrit kavya tradition, the alamkara tradition of ornamentation. That's what nyangak means in Tibetan. And these alamkaras, these poetic ornaments, similes, and metaphors in the jewel lamp, Khunu Lama draws from the world around him. So first we'll have a frame poem. He says, yoke yourself to others' flourishing, and then heat, cold, hunger, thirst, such pains bring no dismay, but perfect joy. This facet of bodhicitta comes to mind. And then he says, interestingly, he kind of tips his hand. He says, exquisite alamkara is the wealth of poets. In just that way, for holy beings, precious bodhicitta is all their wealth. So there's a kind of parallel between the bodhicitta cultivated by Buddhist meditators, and particularly advanced Buddhist meditators, holy beings, and the wealth of poets, which is their wealth of poetic ornament and skill. Now, what are those ornaments? Well, Khunu Lama has a huge repertoire of ornaments, and maybe I'll just mention some of those ornaments because it's so wonderful to see the breadth. He says bodhicitta is like a sword of protection. It's like armor. It's like lightning. It's like a lamp. It's like the sun. It's like the moon. It's like a magical stallion that gallops instantly across the sky. It's like the palace of a Chakravartin king. It's like a deer. It's like gold. It's like honey. It's sweet. It's like eating cream. It's like ambrosia. It's like medicine. So it's vastly wonderful, and we can engage it with our senses, interestingly. But one of the metaphors that Khunu Lama really leans into, following in Sanskrit and Tibetan Buddhist literary traditions, well-worn paths before him, is the image of the lotus flower. So he says, just like the lotus among flowers, bodhicitta is supreme among virtues. It brings immediate and ultimate happiness, so fervently strive to arouse it. And Khunu Lama would have assumed that his audience would have known that Buddhists have been comparing Buddhist practitioners and virtue to lotuses for over 2,000 years. Now, why do Buddhists love to talk about lotuses so much? Well, for the same reason that the broader Indic literary traditions like to use the lotus as a metaphor for spiritual cultivation, because as we see in this picture, and as we probably all already know from our studies, lotuses grow with their roots in mud. They need water and they need kind of a rich, organic, muddy environment to nurture their roots. And then the flower itself and these big leaves float on the top of the water and are very beautiful to the human eye. And so many poets in Sanskrit and Tibetan tradition have pointed out that from a human perspective, the flower and its leaves are very bright, very clean, very gorgeous. Lotuses also have hundreds of petals, many, many petals, which is so dazzling to the human eye. And then the roots are embedded in rich, nutrient dense organic mud, which is nice for the flowers, but which humans think is kind of gross. We don't like to put our feet in it, right? And so it's a metaphor for how the ordinary muddiness of the world and our experiences and our feelings and our tangled relationships, that whole kind of composty mixture is not really something bad. It's something that nourishes spiritual practice, even though spiritual practice, in a sense, also seems to transform it or to purify it. So this metaphor of the lotus is a recurring theme. And lotuses are the most prized flowers in Indian literature and in Tibetan literature, the chief of the flowers. So just like the lotus, bodhicitta is the chief among the virtues. We also see a lot of metaphors involving water and moisture and rain in Khunu Lama's poems. And I'll come back to why that might be such an interesting clue about what sort of poet he is. He says here, Joy when gentle rain comes on time. Joy when crops ripen in the fields. Such joy if bodhicitta would well up in the minds of all living beings. And he says there's nectar in the lotus flower, bodhicitta in the Buddha's children. That one only benefits some. This one perfectly benefits all. So to understand the relationship of these two poems and the rain metaphor that comes actually through both of them, one has to know that in Mahayana literature, there is a recurring Alamkara poetic image of the reign of the Dharma, the reign of the teachings of Buddhism, the reign of equanimity, that the reign of the Mahayana Buddhist path, according to Mahayana writers, is completely nonpartisan. It falls equally on everybody. It's equally useful to everybody. And a metaphor for this from the world of nature is the way that the rain falls on everything, producing fertility, producing human and animal food, allowing life to continue and flourish. And so we get in this first poem, joy when the gentle rain comes on time, seasonally, right? Allowing crops and the harvest to flourish. And there's an analogy there with bodhicitta welling up in the minds of beings, nourishing the crops, right, of their Buddhahood and their compassionate activity in the world. And there's also this sense of the equanimity of the reign of bodhicitta. So here the lotus actually takes kind of a second best seat. Lotuses have nectar, which is wonderful and sweet, but bodhicitta is fully beneficial to everybody. It's impartial, right? This impartial reign of Buddhist teaching. All right, let's keep going because we have these wonderful metaphors, but Khunu Lama also embeds a critique of the whole project of metaphor in his poems themselves. He uses his vast repertoire of poetic ornament to motivate himself and his audience to cultivate bodhicitta, but he also says, ultimately speaking, there is no metaphor for bodhicitta. Metaphors run dry when we come to thinking about bodhicitta. So he says, poets search, but find no metaphor for bodhicitta. Expressing bodhicitta through a simile, any metaphor at all falls short. So Alamkara ultimately is not equal to the vastness of what he claims for the Buddhist path. It is a gesture toward that vastness, but it falls short. So there's a kind of tension between the parallelism between self-cultivation and of Buddhist qualities like bodhicitta and the poetic self-cultivation required to produce poetic ornament. And yet Khunu Lama always wants to privilege the Buddhist side of that equation. He always wants to insist that bodhicitta is supreme. It transcends all poetry, all nature images, all examples. And yet, so interesting how his poetic project and its success depends so much on the power of poetic ornament. This particular poem, verse 333, I especially like because if you think about the ornaments that he uses here, which all revolve around the figure of the bird, the cuckoo, as the messenger of spring, the messenger of the rains, the rainy season, we get a very strong sense of how embedded Khunu Lama must have been in the Sanskrit literary world of figures like the Sanskrit poet Kalidasa, the 4th or 5th century great poet who famously wrote a poem called the Meghaduta, the Cloud Messenger, in which he works marvels using the associations that his audience will have with the arrival of the rainy season. So if you're dry, if you're parched, if you're worried about your crops and your future harvest, and if you're parted from your beloved, then rain is bliss. Rain is moisture. Rain brings life back to the world. And rain is the season in which people can't travel. And so you get to be with your lover and stay with them because you can't go anywhere. And there's a little tiny echo of that Kalidasa relationship to moisture, rainy season, and the cuckoo bird, whose song is the messenger of the spring rains. In this verse by Khunu Lama, he says, "Bodhicitta moistened speech is melodious to the ear, just as the ears rejoice at the intoxicated song of the messenger of spring." So this poem doesn't tell us that we can't use poetry to talk about bodhicitta. This poem leans deeply in to a highly cultivated awareness of a Sanskritic and Tibetan literary tradition that makes this web of metaphors possible. We don't even hear the word cuckoo, we hear messenger of spring. We know that that intoxicated song is a recurring trope for Sanskrit writers, and then for Tibetan writers who inherit from them. We have this idea of speech and melody, of the ears rejoicing. And we have this idea of the Buddhist virtue of bodhicitta as having a kind of moisture quality, like the rains that heal the parched earth of the subcontinent when the rains return. So all of that is available to an audience that has cultivated its literary knowledge and its awareness of what these nature images signify and can receive the poem. And so I read that, and this is the second part of my argument that I invite you to ask me questions about in the Q&A in a moment. I read that as a clue about what might be so interesting to Khunu Lama about the connection he makes between poetic effort and cultivation and Buddhist meditative effort and cultivation. What might be interesting about them, perhaps, is that both of them require a kind of dynamic tension between effort and experience. In the Sanskritic literary tradition, the aesthetic experience is likened to taste. The word in Sanskrit, rasa, savor, flavor, taste, or mood for the aesthetic mode of particular literary works, tells us something about the human sensorium and the embodied, direct, take you over quality that revelatory artistic experience can have. And that revelatory taking over my body with experience is often used as a clue or a metaphor or a harbinger or an analog for spiritual experience, not only by Mahayana Buddhists, but also by all kinds of bhakti poets writing in languages in India and elsewhere in South Asia for centuries, who talk about that kind of total takeover that can come with a moment of spiritual revelation. And at the same time, to receive the full aesthetic impact of a work like this verse of Khunu Lama's, we need to have somebody explain it to us. We need to train, we need to practice. Maybe we have to write some poetry ourselves. We have to cultivate our faculty of aesthetic appreciation, because jokes aren't funny if somebody explains them to you. Poems aren't beautiful when some person with a giant head on a screen is walking you through what it means, right? It's not very aesthetically consuming. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm at a lecture and I'm having lunch, right? So there's some prep time needed to be able to read a verse like this and have it land without explanation. It lands and you have the experience. And that's the goal. But to have that be the case, you have to cultivate in advance. And the same is true in the way spiritual experience is presented by Bhakti traditions and by Mahayana Buddhists in the Tibetan context, specifically for our purposes today. So Khunu Lama's traditions of meditation that he practiced do talk about direct experiences of reality as it is. And that is, in fact, a way of expressing the goal of the spiritual path that Khunu Lama practiced and taught. But in order to have that kind of direct experience dawn in the mind, one has to cultivate first all of the virtues, all of the knowledge, all of the ethical practices that set the stage and make one the right vessel or the right vehicle for that dawning awareness. And so my suggestion is that that emphasis on cultivation and then awakening is the real hook for Khunu Lama in the writing of nature poetry. That the parallels between the two kinds of cultivation give him a way to train himself and train his audience in a special kind of receptivity that involves effort, but ultimately transcends effort. And also, and not for nothing, that does not denigrate bliss and pleasure, that cultivates a kind of pleasurable revelation as part of that dawning awareness. So I'll stop there so that we have some time for some questions. And I will stop the share, although I'll be happy to start it again if people have things that they'd like to come back to. And please let me know what you'd like to talk about.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I have so many questions. Some of them I will save because they're very specific. But you talked about so many things that we were talking about. We talked about bodhicitta today in our Buddhism class. And we've been writing Sanskrit poetry in my advanced Sanskrit class. And I'm curious, did he also write in Sanskrit? And also, you made me want to learn Tibetan, but is there meter in the same way as there is in Sanskrit?
Yes, very much so. So I must say, I love to read and I'm playing around with translating these verses. But as you guys have probably noticed, when you try to move between Sanskrit and English, so much gets lost. Translators have to make these choices between keeping the meter or making the meaning really clear. So the Tibetan quatrains very much have meter, and that's part of what's so awesome about them. Some of them are short and punchy. Some of them are a little bit longer, more like a iambic pentameter kind of vibe. But the meter is essential. The thing is that Tibetan is syllabic, and it can press a huge amount of poetic references and layers of meaning into 2 or 4 syllables, where in English, you need like a full sentence or two to like get all of the layers across. And so that makes a real problem for the English language poet who's working with that. But yes, very much meter. You might have also noticed that the Tibetan script, this capital letter writing in particular that I used, looks a little bit like Devanagari. That is because the Tibetan script was developed on the basis of a Kashmiri script, which itself had been developed from Devanagari. So the 2 writing systems actually have a lot in common. If you know Sanskrit, Tibetan writing is much easier, although the Tibetan language is not related to Sanskrit. And in that sense, it's not, not any easier. And then Khunu Lama did work extensively with Sanskrit and taught Sanskrit extensively and, studied and wrote in Sanskrit. In the 50s, he was actually asked to broadcast on the All India Radio to do a Sanskrit radio hour, which he refused because he was too much of a renunciant. But he was a big Sanskrit reader and writer. To my knowledge, he didn't write poetry in Sanskrit, which is interesting. Oh, great question. Did Khunu Rinpoche teach meditations on the 5 elements? That is a great question. I'm not sure exactly what meditations you have in mind. He was primarily a Dzogchen and Mahamudra practitioner and teacher. But one of the things he was also famous for was being very, very, very ecumenical, sort of between India and Tibet, and between even between Buddhism and other Indian religious traditions. Although he thought Buddhism was best, but he spent a lot of time with Jains, a lot of time with yoga practitioners. He apparently did yoga himself, hatha yoga poses, as well as yogic study. He spent time with various Hindu practitioners. He lived in Varanasi and Benares for much of his second half of his life, actually, in an ashram, in a Shaivite ashram that's still there. And he tried to teach people based on the philosophical system that they came in with. So if you said, I'm a Gelugpa Tibetan Buddhist, he would teach you that. And if you said, I'm a Dzogchen meditator, he would teach you that. And if you said, you know, I'm a Bhakti practitioner and all I want to do is recite, I don't know, Mirabai, you know, he would work with you on that.
Thank you. Dr. Chappell, did you want to jump in on that? I know that was your question.
Sure, I just want to say hello to Professor Pitkin. I read your book, loved the book, taught a class based on your book, and you really convey a sense of how magnanimous he was, as well as the delicacy of, as you told us today, his sensitivity to a wide range of traditions. So I want to first applaud the book. And then my question comes because our class, which you've seen on the screen, and I'll turn it around, you'll see them again, will be starting today a sequence of 5 elemental meditations that go back to the original teachings that the Buddha gave to his own son. So that's where that question came from. And what I want to follow up with is a little bit of bodhicitta. And we often hear of the 4 immeasurables, which are common in yoga, Jainism, Buddhism. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about Maitri, Karuna, Mudita, Upeksha.
Wonderful. Great question. Thank you. And thank you so much for your kind words about the book and for teaching it. That's so marvelous to hear. Yes. So actually the 5-element meditation is very much something that Khunu Lama's tradition does do and does teach about. There's actually a wonderful book with a kind of Dzogchen perspective on the 5 elements, the name of which is escaping me, but I will send it to you, a lovely paperback, recent contemporary work by a contemporary Lama who actually has a strong connection to Khunu Rinpoche. So Khunu Lama's Dzogchen tradition very much does 5-element meditations. And then in terms of thinking about the 4 immeasurables and Maitri and Karuna, so loving kindness and compassion, these are seen by Khunu Lama's tradition as essential building blocks of what will eventually become bodhicitta. So one of the things that, you know, we often say when we're explaining the Buddhist path, that you all have probably talked about a lot, is that you can think of becoming a Buddha as like being a bird with 2 wings, you know, here, my 2 little hands. So you have to have the wisdom wing, the prajna, right? You have to have prajna paramita. You have to have the perfection of wisdom to become a Buddha, to know reality as it is. And then you also have to have the perfection of the Maitri and Karuna, of the loving kindness and compassion, which can be thought of as the perfection of ethics or the perfection of relationality, the perfection of compassion and care. And also you could think of that as all going into what produces bodhicitta. So the sort of traditional gloss is that Maitri, or loving kindness, is the wish for beings to be happy. And Karuna, or great compassion, Mahakaruna, is the wish for beings to be free from suffering. So those are 2 of the 4 immeasurables, right? And then you also, I'm sure you guys now know from your class that a key kind of takeaway of the 4 immeasurables is number 4, which is this idea of the equanimity, of wanting beings not just to be happy and free from suffering and to have joy, but also to the sympathetic joy, mudita, but for all beings to want that for each other and not to want it more for ones they like and less for ones they don't like, right? So that letting go of picking and choosing and having the wish, the Maitri and Karuna for everybody, that's kind of what those mind training practices that Khunu Lama taught so much, they're all about, right? Because if you can see all beings as your beloved parents or your beloved children, both metaphors are very important, then it starts to be possible to want happiness and well-being for all of them, even when they're being horrible right now, right? So that attitude together then is required in Khunu Lama's tradition in order to generate bodhicitta. You have to, on the one hand, think that Buddhahood is the best goal, and then you have to really want it for everybody. And when those two things come together, then you can generate bodhicitta.
Awesome, thank you. We have a few more minutes if anybody else has questions here or on Zoom. Love the way you explained all of that. So, and the bird thing, I love that. Yeah.
The cuckoo. Maybe I'll say one more thing, you know, to, oh no, here's a question. Lovely. Oh my goodness. Hello, Carla. Oh, nice to see you. This poetry is one of the few texts that the current Dalai Lama teaches. Why do I think that is? That is a great question. So there's definitely, I think, a kind of preference often in Tibetan Buddhist formal teaching settings for the classics, so to speak. And so it can take a while before contemporary work kind of meets the criteria of the classics. So it's very striking that Khunu Lama's bodhicitta poems seem to have become something of a modern classic. And that is very much a choice that the 14th Dalai Lama has made. People sometimes see the current Dalai Lama as a certain kind of modernist, someone who's willing to add to the repertoire of classics. And he's also someone who's very committed to this non-sectarian ecumenical approach to Buddhist teachings. And these bodhicitta poems by one of the most famous ecumenical non-sectarian figures of the 20th century, which take a very non-sectarian approach. Like everyone can do this. You know, you could even do this if you weren't a Buddhist, you could still read these poems. You could see that aspect of the poems as making them particularly valuable to the Dalai Lama and kind of relevant to the Dalai Lama. And of course, you could see that as partly a result of the precariousness of diaspora, right? It's particularly important to bring people together. And you could also see it as part of the 14th Dalai Lama's own intellectual and spiritual and literary projects, which are very much aimed at a kind of inclusivity, kind of connecting the present and the future with the inherited traditions of the past in a way that includes lots of voices, including kinds of voices who might have been more marginal in previous centuries. So for all those reasons, I think Khunu Lama's work really kind of fits.
So on behalf of our class, I want to say thank you. We're going to have to transition. So I look forward to communicating. I got to get your email. And again, thank you so much for being with us. Let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you guys so much. Wonderful to see you all. Thank you for having me.